Arctic Point Amasia Hook. The blizzard hit Iron Creek like the end of the world. Inside Arctic Point Military Medical Center, the lights were still on, the monitors still beeping, the overnight staff still moving between beds. Right up until the emergency entrance exploded inward and 4 men in tactical gear flooded the corridor with automatic weapons raised. Staff screamed. A corpsman dove behind a supply cart. Someone hit the floor, pulling a patient's IV pole down with them. Every person in that hallway was shouting at the same person, to run, to hide, to get down. Nurse Emily Carter, 29 years old, 5'6", stood perfectly still in the middle of the corridor and looked directly at the lead gunman. "You picked the wrong hospital," she said. 3 seconds later, the first attacker dropped, and nobody in that hallway had seen her move. If this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because this one goes places you won't see coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Done. The night it started, Emily Carter had been on hour 9 of a 12-hour shift and was running on bad coffee and a granola bar she'd eaten standing over a medication cart at 2 a.m. Iron Creek, Alaska was not a glamorous posting. The town itself had maybe 6,000 permanent residents, a cannery that had seen better decades, 2 bars, and a road that became genuinely impassable for about 11 weeks out of every year. Arctic Point Military Medical Center served the remote Marine installation 12 miles outside of town, and by extension the civilian population that had no other hospital within 140 miles in any direction. Emily had been assigned there 8 months ago, transferred from a larger facility downstate after a scheduling conflict that her supervisor at the time had described without much diplomacy as a personality issue. What that meant in practice was that Emily had documented a medication error made by a senior physician, pushed the incident up the chain when her direct supervisor told her to let it go, and then found herself quietly reassigned to the edge of the continent before the ink was dry on the formal complaint.
She hadn't fought it. That was the thing people didn't understand about her. She almost never fought the things that happened to her. She just kept moving. Iron Creek suited her in ways she didn't examine too carefully. The cold didn't bother her. The isolation didn't bother her. The Marines who cycled through the medical center were occasionally difficult patients, stubborn about pain, bad at following discharge instructions, prone to deciding they were fine before they were remotely fine. But she understood that particular brand of stubbornness better than she'd ever let on. Her shift partner that night was a traveling nurse named Dara Owe, 26, who had arrived from Atlanta 4 months ago and spent approximately 60% of her working hours talking about how she was not going to renew her contract, and the other 40% being very good at her job. They had reached the comfortable stage of coworkership where they could go 40 minutes without speaking, and neither of them took it personally. "Weather's getting ugly," Dara said, not looking up from the chart she was updating. The wind had been building for 2 hours, and the windows on the north side of the building had started making a low, continuous moan that the older staff called the usual, and the newer staff found deeply unsettling. "Storm's supposed to peak around 4, Emily said. She was rechecking the medication dosages for a Marine in bed 6, Staff Sergeant Rohr, 31, post-surgical, recovering from a Schraber wound to the left thigh that had gone septic before he'd admitted it was serious. He was asleep now, which was the best thing for him. "Road'll be closed by morning," Dara said. "Road's already closed." Darla looked up. "For real. Checked 20 minutes ago. Nothing in or out until they plow."
Emily marked the chart and moved to the next bed. "We're at until at least 0700. Dra absorbed this and went back to her charting. "Great. Love being stranded in a hospital during a blizzard. Very calming environment." Emily almost smiled. Almost. The first explosion, and she recognized it as an explosion immediately, not a door slamming, not a generator vault, came from the level below them at 2:41 a.m. She was already moving before the sound finished echoing. The stairwell door hit the wall when she pushed through it. Below her, in the ground floor corridor, she could hear shouts, the specific kind that weren't panic, that had direction and command built into them. And underneath those, the sounds of people scrambling that were panic. A crash, something heavy falling, and then unmistakably the distinct mechanical sound of a weapon being racked. Emily stopped on the landing between floors. She did not keep going down. She did not retreat back up. She stood completely still for approximately 4 seconds and listened. 4 entry points to the ground floor: emergency entrance, main entrance, loading dock at the east end, service corridor from the parking structure. The sounds were coming from the emergency entrance and spreading east, which meant they'd come through the main breach and were moving toward the interior rather than securing the perimeter first. That was either arrogance or urgency, possibly both. She counted voices, 4 distinct command voices in the corridor below, which meant a team of at least that size to say, 3, Rohr can't,
And neither can Vasquez. She's still post-anesthesia. Wheelchairs for Roar and Vasquez. The three who can walk, you move them now. Back corridor, lock the connecting door and do not open it for anyone until you hear my voice. Emily.
Dara. She looked at her directly. Move fast and stay quiet. I'll be right behind you. It was a partial truth. She wasn't going to be right behind her. She waited until Dara turned and started moving. And then she went to the medication storage room, which was the one room on the ward with an internal lock and no external windows, and which happened to share a wall with the maintenance access corridor that ran the length of the building below floor level. There was a panel in the back of the medication storage room that was labeled HVAC access, do not block. Emily had noticed it her second week on the posting, in the way she noticed most things, cataloging it, filing it, not thinking about it consciously again until she needed it. She needed it now. The access corridor was not designed for human navigation. It was designed for ductwork and pipes. Emily moved through it on her hands and knees in near total darkness, one hand on the pipe to her left as a guide, tracking sound through the building the way the building's own air moved downward and east toward the emergency entrance. She came up through a floor access panel in a utility closet off the main ground floor corridor, behind the position the attackers had already passed. There were 6 of them on the ground floor. She confirmed this in the first 30 seconds of observation through a 2-inch gap in the closet door. 6, not 4. 4 had moved toward the interior, and 2 were stationed at the emergency entrance, which they'd secured behind them. They were dressed in cold weather tactical gear with no identifying markings, carrying weapons that were not standard civilian issue.
These weren't panicked criminals. They were organized. The ground floor nursing station had been cleared. The 2 staff members who'd been on duty were zip-tied to the waiting area chairs, scared but visibly unharmed. The attackers were moving with purpose towards something, not just creating chaos. Emily watched the 2 at the entrance, watched their pattern, watched where they looked and how often and for how long. She had not done this in 3 years. Her hands were steady. One of the men at the entrance moved to check his radio and turned 45 degrees away from his partner. The partner was watching the interior corridor and not the utility closet. Emily was out of the closet in 2 seconds. The first man didn't finish turning back around. The second man got a syllable out before he didn't either. She zip-tied both of them with the restraints from the emergency station supply cabinet, the same ones they'd used on the nursing staff, and moved to the 2 zip-tied nurses, cutting them loose with a pair of bandage scissors. "Back stairwell," she said quietly. "Second floor, back corridor. Knock twice slowly. Don't run. Walk fast. Keep low. Don't look back." The older nurse, a woman named Parar, who'd been at Arctic Point for 11 years, grabbed Emily's arm. "They took Dr. Marchand. They took him toward radiology."
Emily filed that. "How many staff unaccounted for? I don't know, maybe. There were 4 of us down here when they came in. Go now, both of you." They went. The next thing Emily needed was information and a position in that order. She moved through the ground floor using service corridors she'd memorized during the building's mandatory fire safety orientation, the one that most of the rotating staff sat through on their phones, and that Emily had spent actually looking at the floor plans. She found the first of the 4 interior attackers near radiology, which confirmed what Parr had told her. They had Marchand, the hospital's senior physician on overnight duty, a 53-year-old former Army surgeon named Warren Marchand, who ran the night shift with a specific brand of exhausted competence that Emily had developed a cautious respect for. They were using him as a key, moving through the secure sections of the building. The second man she took down in the radiology corridor, the third near the pharmaceutical storage. By the time the fourth realized something was wrong, he'd lost communication with 3 of his teammates, and the 2 at the entrance weren't answering. He made a mistake. Then he spoke out loud. Not quietly, not over his radio. He actually spoke out loud to the corridor around him, the way people do when they're trying to project calm they don't feel. "Whoever's doing this, you don't know what you walked into." Emily was behind the supply car 12 feet to his left. "I was thinking the same thing about you," she said. He spun. She was already gone, dropped below the cart line, moving lateral, and when he tracked right, she came from the left, and that was the end of that conversation. Dr. Marchand was in the radiology prep room, hands zip-tied to a chair, a cut above his eyebrow that had bled significantly down his face, but wasn't deep. He stared at Emily when she came through the door. "Carter," his voice was genuinely baffled. "What? How did you—" "I need you to stay here," she said, cutting his restraints. "Don't turn the lights on. There are 2 more of them, and I haven't found them yet." "2 more?"
"Emily, there are armed men in the hospital." "I know. I've handled 4 of them." She checked the corridor through the door gap. "Clear. You're going to lock this door and stay down. The staff on the 2nd floor are in the back corridor. You'll be able to reach them in about 10 minutes when I tell you it's clear." Martian looked at her face, looked at the way she was holding herself, looked at the absolute lack of panic in her expression. "Who are you?" he said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Your nurse, Emily said. Lock the door. The two remaining men were the problem. They were together, which meant they'd noticed the silence and consolidated, smart enough to recognize the pattern of what had happened to their team, and smart enough not to split up further. They'd moved to the generator room, which was the building's most defensible interior position. Single entry point, concrete walls, direct access to the power systems. They were going to use the hospital's infrastructure as leverage. Emily stood outside the generator room door and thought about this for a moment. The door was solid steel. She wasn't going through it directly. The ceiling above the generator room was a false ceiling, acoustic tile, over a mechanical access space that served the entire east wing. She'd noted the ceiling access point in the east corridor during that same fire safety orientation. She went up. Moving across ceiling tiles in the dark above the generator room required approximately 3 minutes of extremely careful weight distribution and zero sound. She found the tile directly above the room's interior, confirmed the position of both men below for the gap at the tile's edge, both looking at the door, not the ceiling. And then she did something she'd learned a long time ago in a different life, in a different kind of building. She made a noise, not at the ceiling tile, at the air duct 15 feet to the east. Both men turned toward it. She came down through the tile on the west end. It wasn't clean. The second man was faster than she'd accounted for, and got a hand on her before she'd fully closed the distance, and they went into the generator housing hard enough that she felt it in her shoulder for a week afterward. But the room had a lot of hard surfaces, and she used 3 of them before it was over. She sat on the floor of the generator room for exactly 60 seconds afterward, breathing. Her hands were still steady. She found that mildly surprising, if she was honest.
The facility had a backup radio in the security station, which she reached 2 minutes later. She raised the marine installation on the emergency frequency. The storm had chewed through the cellular repeaters, but the hardline radio was still working, and got a corporal on the other end who sounded like he'd been asleep. "This is Nurse Carter at Arctic Point Medical," she said. "I need you to wake up your duty officer right now and tell them we had an armed incursion. 6 attackers, all incapacitated, no fatalities on staff. 2 staff members sustained minor injuries. I need a team here. I need medical backup for the team currently on the installation. And I need someone to tell me who these people are, because their gear is not civilian issue and neither are their weapons." A very long pause on the other end. "Ma'am," the corporal said slowly, "did you just say 6 attackers, all incapacitated?" Emily said, "Send a team." She set down the radio and started the walk back toward the second floor to let her patients know it was over. She was halfway up the stairwell when the south entrance, the one she hadn't covered because she'd been operating on the assumption that the storm had sealed it, came open. 3 more men came through it. She stopped on the landing. 9 then, not 6. 9. And the last 3 had waited out her clearance of the first group before making entry. One of them looked up the stairwell and saw her. "That's her," he said. And the way he said it, the specific weight on those 2 words, the way it landed like a confirmation rather than a discovery, told Emily something she hadn't known 30 seconds ago. They hadn't come for the hospital. They'd come for her. The landing door to the second floor was 20 feet above her. The ground floor was blocked below. The stairwell was a kill box. 4 concrete walls, 1 exit up, 1 exit down, and 3 armed men starting up the stairs.
Emily looked at the fire suppression pipe that ran along the stairwell's east wall, looked at the junction box 6 feet up the wall to her left, looked at the door to the second floor mechanical space that the hospital's maintenance chief had propped open 3 weeks ago because the latch was broken and hadn't been fixed yet. She looked at all of this in about 2 seconds. Then she moved. The fire suppression pipe took her weight barely, and only for the 3 seconds she needed to reach the junction box, which she used as a step to the broken mechanical space door, which swung open inward, and she was through it before the first of the 3 men reached the landing below. The mechanical space for the second floor ran above the patient rooms. Emily moved through it at a crouch, fast, tracking the sound of the men below her through the floor structure. They were coordinating. She could hear the cadence of it, the call and response of a search pattern. They knew how to clear a building. That was a problem. They also knew, or thought they knew, who they were looking for. That was a different kind of problem, and a larger one. And it sat in Emily's chest with a specific weight that she recognized from a long time ago. The weight of something you've been waiting for, that you hoped wouldn't come, that has come anyway. She reached the second floor access panel above the back corridor, directly above the door behind which Drea and the patients and the 2 ground floor nurses were waiting. She couldn't open that panel, not with the search team below her, not without giving away the position. She needed to redirect them, draw them away from the corridor, back toward the ground floor by enough time for the marine team to reach them. She was still working out exactly how to do this when from somewhere below in the ground floor corridor, she heard a sound she hadn't expected. A radio transmission, clear, unencrypted, coming through one of the attacker's own communication systems. A voice she didn't recognize, calm, clipped, authoritative. Change of clan, don't engage, confirm her location and hold position. And then, after a pause, command needs her alive. Emily went very still in the dark above the patient corridor. Below her, the search team went still too. She heard one of them say quietly to the others, "Alive, you heard it." "Yeah," said another, sigh. "Somebody upstairs just made her a lot more valuable than a body. Means they're scared of what she knows," said the third.
A long silence in the mechanical space above the second floor of Arctic Point Military Medical Center, while the storm screamed against the building's outer walls, and the lights flickered twice, and the temperature in the unheated crawl space dropped another 2 degrees. Emily thought about what she knew. She thought about the past 3 years, the transfer to Iron Creek, the quiet posting, the careful distance she'd kept from everything she'd walked away from. She thought about a weapons cache in a forward operating base that shouldn't have existed. She thought about a report she'd filed that had disappeared into an administrative review that had never produced results. She thought about the fact that she'd told herself for 3 years that the disappearance of that report was probably just bureaucratic failure. She was no longer telling herself that. Below her, in the corridor, one of the men's radios clicked again. "Extraction team is 12 minutes out," the voice said. "Hold her. We cannot let her reach the Marines." Emily Carter lay flat in the crawl space above the second floor of her hospital, listening to the storm and the men below, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not fear, exactly. Something colder than fear, and more useful. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and found by touch the broken tile bolt she'd pocketed when she came down from the generator room ceiling.
She turned it over in her fingers. 12 minutes. She had 12 minutes before an extraction team arrived. 3 armed men between her and her patients, a Marine response team that might or might not reach them in time, and evidence somewhere in this building, on the gear of the men she'd taken down, in their communications equipment, in the weapons they were carrying, that connected to something much larger than an attack on a remote Alaskan hospital. She was not going to spend those 12 minutes hiding in a ceiling. She started moving. She started moving. The crawl space above the second floor was exactly 31 inches of clearance between the ceiling joists and the subfloor above. Emily had measured it by feel during the first pass-through, cataloging without thinking about it the way she always did. 31 inches was enough to move flat on her stomach without the structure creaking. If she distributed her weight across 3 points and kept her pace below a certain speed. She knew this because she'd spent 12 minutes in it already, and the men below hadn't hurt her once. She also knew she couldn't maintain that pace for the next 12 minutes and accomplish anything useful. The extraction team was the problem she kept returning to. The 6 men she'd handled were not extraction. They'd been the breach team, the ones meant to cause enough chaos that whatever came next had clear space to operate. 3 of them had been held back specifically for her, which meant whoever was running this operation had anticipated that the first 6 might not be enough. That level of planning didn't happen overnight. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had resources. The radio she'd heard through the floor below her was still transmitting intermittently. She could track the voices even through the insulation and the structural noise of the storm. The 3 men were moving slowly, doing a systematic sweep of the ground floor's secondary rooms while keeping a loose perimeter on the stairwell. They weren't rushing. They were waiting for the extraction team and keeping the exits covered. Emily moved toward the east end of the call space. The east end terminated above the hospital's trauma bay, which was sealed and unused during the overnight shift, except for the supply staging area along its south wall.
More importantly, the trauma bay had a direct external access point, the ambulance bay, which connected to the parking structure, which was how the final 3 had come in through the south entrance. She found the access panel above the trauma bay and tested its edge with 2 fingers. It gave slightly. No latch on this one, just resting weight. She eased it up 1/2 inch and looked through. The trauma bay was dark and empty. No one had thought to post someone here, because no one had thought this position mattered. She dropped down, caught herself on the gurney rail below, came down the rest of the way without sound, straightened up.
On the wall beside the trauma bay entrance, there was an emergency equipment cabinet, the kind that every room of this type was required to have, stocked quarterly, and that most people walked past without ever really looking at. Emily opened it and took stock of what was there in about 4 seconds. Defibrillator, O2 unit, trauma bandages, an emergency airway kit, and because this particular cabinet had been stocked for a facility serving an active military installation, a tourniquet, and 2 chest seals still in packaging. She was not here for the medical supplies. Behind the defibrillator, pushed to the back of the lower shelf, was the cabinet's secondary contents, a handheld radio, still in his charging cradle, that was part of the hospital's internal emergency communication system, the system that worked off the building's own hardwired network rather than the cell repeaters the storm had killed. She keyed the radio to the frequency she'd used from the security station and raised the same corporal she'd spoken to 20 minutes ago. "This is Carter again. Where's my team?" The corporal's voice was different now, not half asleep, sharply awake. "Ma'am, duty officer is Lieutenant Colonel Bryce. She's been briefed. We have a response team en route. ETA 14 minutes. Storm slowing them. There's a secondary team inbound on the attacker side," Emily said. "Extraction team. Their radio said 12 minutes. That was 6 minutes ago. Your team needs to move faster. We're moving as fast as the road allows. Go around the road." A pause. "Ma'am, there's a blizzard." "I know there's a blizzard, Corporal. Go around the road. Over." She clipped the radio to her scrub pocket.
It was small enough and moved back toward the trauma bay door. She needed those communications devices, the ones on the men she'd already taken down. The first 4 she'd handled were still in the position she'd left them, zip-tied, conscious, or approaching consciousness, none of them going anywhere. She'd left their gear on them because she hadn't had time for anything else. Now she had 6 minutes and a different priority. She moved through the ground floor carefully. The 3 active searchers were working the east corridor. She could track their suite from the radio updates they were exchanging with each other, short and clipped, the language of people who'd done this kind of thing in buildings before. She went west to the corridor near the pharmaceutical storage, where the 3rd man she'd handled was secured to a pipe bracket. He was awake. He watched her come toward him with an expression that was trying to look like it wasn't afraid. "You're Carter," he said. She crouched beside him and started going through the outer pockets of his tactical vest. "You know my name. Everybody knows your name." That's an overstatement. She found his radio, pocketed it, found a phone, locked, biometric, useless to her. Found something more useful in the inner chest pocket, a folded document, printed with a building schematic on one side and what looked like an itinerary on the other. She unfolded it under the beam of the small flashlight she'd taken from the emergency cabinet.
The building schematic was Arctic Point Medical, her hospital, room by room, labeled with staff names and shift assignments. Her name was on it, Nursing Station 2N, night shift, circled in red pen. She looked at the itinerary side. Times, locations, alphanumeric designation she didn't immediately recognize. The last line read, "Package secured. Extraction 0320. It was currently 0314. She looked at the man zip-tied to the pipe bracket. "Who's running this?" "You're not going to get anything out of me." "I don't need anything from you," Emily said. "I've got your documentation." She stood, folded the paper, put it in her pocket. "The Marine team is 6 minutes out. You should probably think about what your cooperation is worth before they get here." She left him and moved back toward the stairwell. The plan, if she'd had time to call it a plan, was straightforward enough. The 3 active searchers needed to be redirected away from the stairwell and away from the 2nd floor before the extraction team arrived. If the extraction team came in through the south entrance and found their breach team neutralized, they'd regroup. If they came in and found the hospital still actively defended, they'd either press or pull back depending on what their orders actually were. The radio transmission had said command needs her alive. That was a constraint on the extraction team, not just the breach team, which meant they weren't going to come in shooting. They were going to come in trying to take her out of this building in a state that allowed her to be interrogated. That was, from a tactical standpoint, both better and worse than the alternative. She was on the ground floor west corridor when the radio in her pocket, the one she'd taken from the pharmaceutical storage, lit up with an incoming transmission. A different voice this time, not the calm, clipped one from before. Older, and something in it that wasn't quite controlled. "Breach team, report status." Silence. "Breach team, a harder edge." "Report." More silence. Then from somewhere in the east corridor, one of the 3 active searchers. "Extraction, be advised. Breach team is down. All 6. We have a situation." A very long pause. "All 6.
The older voice repeated. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of someone doing a rapid reassessment. "Affirmative. She's still in the building. We have eyes on the stairwell. She can't reach the 2nd floor." Emily, standing 20 feet from the stairwell she had no intention of using, felt a very small and deeply unpleasant sense of respect for whoever had designed this operation. They'd thought about the 2nd floor. They thought about the patients. They'd used that as a choke point. They hadn't thought about the crawl space. She went back to the stairwell door, not through it, to the supply alcove beside it, and waited. The east corridor sweep was going to bring the searchers back toward this position in the next 2 to 3 minutes. She needed one of them close enough to separate from the others. While she waited, she kept turning the schematic over in her head, the room labels, the staff assignments. This had been prepared recently. It had her current assignment on it, night shift 2N,
which meant someone had accessed the hospital scheduling system within the past week. You didn't get that from a general record search. You got that from someone with specific access to the facility's internal systems, or from someone embedded within the institution's administrative structure. That thought sat in her chest and did not improve with examination. The sound of boots on linoleum, East Corridor, approaching. She counted the footfall rhythm, one person moving ahead of the others. She waited. The door to the supply alcove was partially open. She was behind it, which meant anyone coming from the east would see the alcove, might see the door, and might decide it was worth checking. That was what she was counting on. The footsteps slowed near the alcove. She heard breathing, someone standing, looking. He came through the door with his weapon up, which was the right move and the wrong outcome for him, because the weapon was the first thing she controlled, and the rest followed from there. He went down without reason or alarm. She used his own zip ties. 2 left in the East Corridor. She heard one of them say from further away, "Garrick, Garrick, you copy?" No answer, obviously. "Extraction. We may have another contact." Garrick's not responding.
"Find her," the older voice said, and now the control was gone from it entirely. "She cannot leave that building with what she's carrying." Emily's hand went to her pocket, the folded schematic. She hadn't been thinking about it as something she was carrying in that sense. She'd been thinking about it as intelligence she'd found. But the extraction team's handler wasn't worried about her getting to the Marines. He was worried about what she would bring with her when she did, which meant the schematic wasn't just a schematic. She pulled it out again, moved to the emergency exit signs, red glow at the end of the supply alcove, and looked at the itinerary side again. The alphanumeric designation she hadn't recognized. She went through them differently now, not looking for obvious meaning, looking for structure. 3 columns, a date column, all within the past 6 months, a location column, the alphanumeric, which she now read as grid coordinates rather than arbitrary designations, and a 3rd column that she'd read as reference numbers, but now looked at differently. They were weight designations, cargo weights. She put the schematic back in her pocket and pressed herself flat against the alcove wall, because the second of the 2 remaining East Corridor searchers had just come around the corner and was 30 feet away and moving fast. She needed to think about this later. Right now, she needed to not be found. He was moving fast because Garrick hadn't responded, because his team was down to 2, because the extraction team was close, and he was trying to cover ground before they arrived, and he had to explain to someone with authority why 6 men had been neutralized by a hospital nurse in under 20 minutes. He was scared and covering it with speed, and he didn't clear the alcove before he passed it. She was behind him before he finished passing. That left one active searcher in a building where all the exits were covered by incoming Marines, and an extraction team that was now about 3 minutes out. One searcher who had a radio and was reporting back to a handler who was beginning to understand that the operational calculus had shifted in a way that was not recoverable. Emily stood in the supply alcove and listened to the building.
The storm was still going. The wind had a different quality now, less sustained, more gusting, which meant the worst of it had peaked, and the Marines on the road might have just gotten marginally better visibility. The lights on the ground floor had been steady for the past 10 minutes, which meant the generator was holding. The remaining searcher was somewhere in the east wing. She could hear him. Not footsteps now, but the occasional small creak of the building that happened when someone was trying not to make footsteps. He'd gone still. He was waiting too. Her radio crackled. "Carter?" The older voice directly on her frequency now. They'd scanned for active transmissions and found the one she'd taken from the pharmaceutical storage. Of course they had. "Carter? I know you're listening." She didn't answer. "You found the document," the voice said. "I know you did, because you went back for the gear, and Renfrew is the one you would have checked first, so you have it, and you're smart enough to understand what it means." She was starting to understand what it meant. She wanted him to keep talking. "We're not here to hurt anyone in that hospital. We never were. You were a retrieval target, not a... This wasn't supposed to go this way." A pause. Something in his voice that might have been genuine and might have been tactical. Come out, and we get on the transport, and I promise you on my word that everyone in that building walks away from tonight." Emily kept her breathing even. "Or," the voice said, and the something genuine evaporated. "My team comes in and we find you the hard way, and the people in that hospital get to watch." She keyed the radio. "Your team's already had the hard way." A silence on the other end. "Then you've been out of the field for 3 years. I know. You took down 6 trained operators in, but 7, she said. Garrick was 8. Another silence, longer.
The document.
he said finally. Give it back and we stand down. You have my word. Your word, Emily said, is attached to an operation that put my name on a target list and sent 9 men into a civilian medical facility during a blizzard. I'm going to need something more than your word. She turned the radio off. They knew her frequency now, which made it a liability rather than an asset. She'd gotten what she needed from the transmission. He was scared of the document, which confirmed what she'd started to piece together from the cargo weight column, and he was stalling, which meant the extraction team's actual arrival was further out than the 3 minutes he'd implied. She came out of the supply alcove and moved east. The remaining searcher heard her. He'd found a position behind the nurses' station at the far end of the east corridor, better cover than most of what the ground floor offered, and it put his back to the wall with sight lines on both approaches. He called out before she was in range. I can see you. Then you know I'm alone, Emily said, stopping where she was in the middle of the corridor. Your whole team is secured. The Marines are 3 minutes out, maybe less. Your extraction team is not as close as your handler told you. You don't know. I know he's scared, she said, and I know you're the last one, which means you're the one who gets to make a decision tonight that the other 8 didn't get to make. She kept her voice level. She wasn't trying to intimidate. There wasn't much point in that. Now, when the Marines come through that door, what they find is going to determine what happens to you for the next 15 to 20 years. That's a fact, not a threat. A long pause from behind the nursing station. They'll charge me regardless, he said. Armed incursion, assault, federal. Yes, Emily said. All of that. But what you know about the operation that sent you here, that's worth something to the right people. That's worth a great deal. She paused. Or you can wait for your handler to decide you're a liability and cut communication, which I give him about 90 seconds to do once he realizes the extraction isn't happening. The man behind the nursing station was quiet for a moment. Then the document you found, do you know what it is? Cargo manifests, Emily said. 6 months of them, grid coordinates that I'm going to need a military map to cross-reference, but I've got a reasonable guess.
They move it through the medical supply chain, he said, and his voice had gone flat. Not cooperative, exactly, more like someone who'd made a decision they'd been sitting on for a while. Shipping containers labeled as medical equipment, routed through legitimate hospital procurement channels. Nobody checks medical supply shipments the way they check other cargo. It's been running for almost 2 years. Emily was very still. Medical supply procurement, routed through hospitals. She thought about Arctic Point's supply chain, the regular shipments from the regional distribution hub, the containers she'd walked past on receiving dock days, labeled with the names of manufacturers she'd never had reason to doubt. The installation, she said, the military installation here, was a transit point, has been for 14 months. He paused. Why do you think they transferred you here? She had thought for 3 years that the transfer to Iron Creek was punishment, bureaucratic exile, the consequence of filing a complaint that inconvenienced people with more authority than her. She stood in the east corridor of Arctic Point Military Medical Center at 03:18 in the morning, in the middle of a blizzard, and recalibrated the past 3 years of her life in about 15 seconds. They put me here to watch, she said. To watch and to contain. He said you saw something in the field, in the report you filed, the one that disappeared. Someone decided it was easier to have you in a remote posting where your access was limited and your credibility was manageable. He paused. Tonight was about the manifest. They found out you'd searched the supply manifests. Someone in hospital administration flagged a records access. They thought you'd already found it. I hadn't, Emily said. I was checking a medication discrepancy in the quarterly order. I wasn't looking for anything. They didn't know that. She heard it then. Through the building's walls, through the storm, the distant but unmistakable sound of vehicle engines. More than one, from the north, which was the main installation road. The Marines. The man behind the nursing station heard it too. She heard him exhale. A long, ragged breath that had a lot of different things in it. I'm going to stand up, he said. I'm going to keep my hands visible. Okay, Emily said. He stood up from behind the nursing station with his hands at shoulder height, weapon left on the floor behind the counter. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s maybe, with the kind of face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like. He was scared in a way that the others hadn't been or hadn't shown. For what it's worth, he said, I didn't know about the hospital. I thought it was a facility extraction. Get one person out. I didn't know there'd be patients. Emily looked at him. She didn't know whether she believed him. and she didn't have enough to go on to decide. "That's between you and whatever investigation follows this," she said. "Right now, you're going to stay exactly where you are with your hands where I can see them until the Marines come through that door." He nodded, stayed where he was. The engines outside grew louder. Headlights hit the north-facing windows and threw long shadows across the ground floor corridor. Emily pulled the schematic from her pocket one more time and looked at the final line of the itinerary. Package secured. Extraction 032. It was 0319.
She thought about what package meant in the context of someone who had filed a complaint that disappeared, who had been transferred to a remote posting, who had spent 3 years assuming it was bureaucratic consequence and not strategic placement. She thought about the cargo manifests and the grid coordinates and the military installation 12 miles from a hospital that received regular, unexamined supply shipments. She thought about the fact that she had entirely by accident just prevented an extraction that would have removed the one person in a position to connect the manifest to the installation, to the wider operation that someone had spent 14 months building inside the legitimate infrastructure of the United States military. The emergency entrance opened. Marines came through in force, 6 of them, full gear, weapons up, sweeping the corridor in the precise and coordinated way that meant someone had briefed them on a real threat, rather than sending them in unprepared. Behind them, a 7th figure in a cold-weather field jacket with the insignia of a lieutenant colonel, moving with the particular kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The lieutenant colonel was a woman, maybe 45, with close-cropped gray at her temples, and an expression that was taken in the corridor. The secured attackers, the last standing searcher with his hands raised, the complete and undisturbed quiet of a building that should have been in chaos, with something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. Her eyes found Emily. Emily was standing in the middle of the east corridor in her nursing scrubs, a folded schematic in her left hand and a zip tie cutter in her right, and she was aware that she looked absolutely nothing like what the situation apparently required her to have been, and she was too tired to find that funny. The lieutenant colonel walked the length of the corridor and stopped 4 feet away. "You're Carter?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." Lieutenant Colonel Daria Bryce. She looked Emily up and down once, not dismissively, more like she was doing an assessment, and the assessment was coming back with results she hadn't anticipated. "My corporal said you called in 6 attackers and then called back to add 2 more. 8, Emily said. "The 9th one is cooperating." Bryce glanced at the man standing behind the nursing station with his hands up, then back at Emily.
"In what capacity were you? What's your background, Carter?" It was the question she'd spent 3 years not answering. Not lying about, exactly. She just never volunteered it, and no one at Arctic Point had asked. You didn't ask nurses about their backgrounds the same way you asked physicians, which was one of the reasons she'd chosen nursing after she'd left the other life behind. She held out the schematic. Bryce took it, unfolded it, looked at it. Her expression shifted in a way that was small but significant. "Where did you get this?" "In her chest pocket. 3rd man I secured, pharmaceutical storage corridor." Emily paused. "The grid coordinates on the itinerary side are transit points. I haven't had access to a military map to confirm, but I believe at least 2 of them correspond to positions within 30 miles of this installation. The cargo weights suggest—" "Carter." Bryce's voice was quiet, not interrupting, stopping her. "How do you know how to read a document like this?" The corridor was quiet, except for the storm and the distant sounds of the Marine team working through the building, confirming the secured positions. The young man behind the nursing station was watching. The motion sensor lights in the east corridor had come back on at full brightness. Emily was very tired. Her shoulder hurt where she'd gone into the generator housing. She had a split in the skin along her left knuckle that she hadn't noticed until it had gotten cold enough for the blood to dry against her skin, and she was going to need to clean that properly before it became her problem in a professional capacity.
"I was a combat medic," she said. "Field operations, 2 tours. I filed a report on an anomalous supply cache 3 years ago, and then I got transferred here." Bryce held the schematic and looked at Emily for a long moment, with an expression that was doing something complicated. "Field operations," she said. "Yes, ma'am," in her eyes that had not been there before. A recognition or a recalibration, or possibly both at once. "The report you filed 3 years ago," Bryce said. "The one that went into administrative review and didn't produce results?" "Yes. We've been looking for the origin of that report for 18 months. Bryce's voice was very careful now, in the way that someone's voice gets careful when they're trying not to say something at the wrong speed.
We couldn't find the source. The intake records were altered. Emily said nothing. The operation connected to these manifests. We've had a partial picture for 8 months.
We knew there was a transit infrastructure using medical supply chains. We could not identify the specific installation being used as the hub. Bryce looked at the schematic, then at Emily. You have been 20 meters from the hub for 3 years. I know, Emily said. They sent 9 men to pull you out of this building before you could reach us. I know that too. Bryce folded the schematic carefully and held it. Around them, the building was coming back to life. She could hear Dara's voice from the second floor, the sound of the back corridor door opening, staff beginning to move. Somewhere down the hall, Dr. Marchand was probably still in the radiology prep room, waiting for Emily's all clear. She should go check on her patients. She was about to say so when Bryce's radio, her own, not the confiscated one, clicked with an incoming transmission. The voice on the other end was not a corporal. It had the particular timbre of someone several ranks above the people currently in this corridor. And the words came out measured and deliberate, the way words get when the person saying them knows they're being recorded. Bryce, what's your status? Building is secure, sir. 9 attackers, all in custody. No staff fatalities. We have... She paused, half a second. We have significant intelligence recovered from the scene, and we have the individual who secured the building. A pause on the other end. The nurse, the voice said. Yes, sir. Another pause, longer. I'm going to need a full brief in the morning. Whatever she has, whatever she's told you, nobody talks to anybody outside this loop until I've seen it. Understood, sir. And Bryce, the voice dropped half a register. Who the hell is she? Bryce was looking at Emily when she answered. That, she said, is currently the most important question in this building. Emily held Bryce's gaze and said nothing, and the storm pressed against the windows. And somewhere in the east corridor, one of the secured men shifted against his restraints and made a sound that was mostly just exhaustion, and the lights held steady.
Her radio, the ground floor security station 1, still clipped to her pocket, buzzed once. She looked down at it reflexively. The screen showed an incoming transmission on a frequency she hadn't programmed and hadn't accessed. The frequency belonged to the extraction team's handler, the one she'd spoken to, the calm, older voice. She looked at it for 1 second. The transmission wasn't audio. It was a data packet, short, compressed, the kind that a tactical field radio could send as a text string. She opened it. 4 words. You don't have everything. Emily read it twice. Her thumb hovered over the response key. The Marines were in the building. Bryce had the schematic. The 9 men were in custody. The second floor was secure. You don't have everything. She looked at the string again, looked at the transmission metadata, the signal origin encoded in the packet header, the way all radio transmissions encoded it, the location data that the sender had not thought to strip before sending, because they'd sent it as a tactical data burst, not a voice call. And stripping metadata from a tactical burst required a step that people forgot when they were rattled. The origin point was not outside the building. It was inside it. Emily looked up from the radio and looked at the corridor around her, at the Marines moving through it, at Bryce, at the young searcher still standing behind the nursing station, and she thought about administrative access, about a scheduling system that had been accessed from inside the institution, about a cargo network that had run for 14 months through a facility-zone supply chain. Someone in this hospital had been helping them, and they were still here. Someone in this hospital had been helping them, and they were still here.
Emily did not say this out loud. That was the first decision, and it mattered more than it might have seemed, because Bryce was 3 feet away and had just established radio contact with someone several ranks above her. And if there was a compromised source inside this building, then the information loop had to be contained before it was widened. Emily didn't know who Bryce reported to. She didn't know how deep this ran. She knew that the manifest had been used as an operational document, that the hospital scheduling system had been accessed from inside, and that someone had just sent her a 4-word message from a position inside Arctic Point Medical Center. She clipped the radio back to her pocket with the screen facing inward and looked at Bryce. I need to check on my patients, she said. 2nd floor. Bryce nodded. I'll have someone come with you. I'm fine alone. Carter, Lieutenant Colonel. Emily kept her voice level. My patients have been in a locked corridor for 40 minutes during an armed incursion. One of them is post-surgical and one is post-anesthesia. I need to assess them. I'll be faster without an escort. Bryce read something in her face. Not all of it, but enough. She held Emily's gaze for 2 seconds. 10 minutes, she said. Then I need you back down here. Emily was already moving. She took the main stairwell this time, openly, because the building was secured, and there was no longer any tactical reason to use the crawlspace. She moved fast. The 2nd floor door opened into the back corridor, and she knocked twice slowly, the way she told Dara, and heard the lock turn from the inside. Dara opened the door and looked at Emily with the specific expression of someone who has been holding themselves together through force of will and is now in the presence of another person, allowing themselves to feel how hard that was. You're okay,
Dar said. It came out like a statement she was testing. I'm okay, Emily said. All clear downstairs. Marines are in the building.
She moved past her to the patients. Ruhr first surgical site intact. No sign of stress-related bleeding through the wound. BP elevated, but within acceptable range for the circumstances. Vasquez was coming out of the anesthesia haze, confused, asking about a sound she'd heard. Emily gave her a brief and honest answer. There had been a security incident. It was resolved. She was safe. Vasquez accepted this with the mild suspicion of someone not yet fully conscious and drifted again. The 2 ground-floor nurses were in the corner. The older one, Parr, had her arms around the younger one, a man named Garrett, who'd been on staff for 6 weeks and was visibly shaking. Emily put her hand briefly on his shoulder. You did everything right, she said, because it was true and because he needed to hear it. She had 4 minutes left. She moved to the nursing station at the back of the corridor, which had a terminal with access to the hospital's internal administration system, the same system that governs scheduling, procurement, supply manifests, and staff records. She logged in with her credentials, opened the access log, and searched for the scheduling record that the attacker's handler had implied had been flagged. The access log showed her own records pull from 6 days ago, a routine medication audit she'd done on the quarterly pharmaceutical order. It also showed 14 minutes after her access, a secondary query on the same records. That query had been run from a terminal in the hospital's administrative office suite on the ground floor. It had been run under the login credentials of the facility's procurement coordinator, a man named Douglas Falk. She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Falk. She'd interacted with him maybe a dozen times, mid-40s, quiet, the kind of person who existed at the edge of a workplace's social geography without leaving much of an impression. He managed the supply ordering system, the vendor relationships, the shipping documentation. Everything that came into this hospital passed through his records in some form.
14 months of shipments. She closed the terminal and went back downstairs. Bryce was where she'd left her, in the east corridor on her radio with the 2 Marines managing the secured attackers. The young last-standing searcher, she still didn't know his name, had been formally placed in custody and was sitting against the wall, wrists secured, watching the room with the focused quiet of someone mentally drafting a statement. Emily stopped beside Bryce and waited for a gap in the radio exchange. The insider source, she said quietly enough that it didn't carry. I know who it is. Bryce ended the transmission talk. Procurement Coordinator Douglas Falk, Administrative Office, ground floor. He accessed the scheduling records 14 minutes after I ran a routine audit 6 days ago and flagged my record pool to whoever planned this. She kept her voice even. He's been managing the supply chain documentation for 14 months. He would have had full visibility into every shipment, every manifest, every incoming container. He's the operational anchor inside this facility. Bryce looked at her. How confident are you? Confident enough to tell you before I tell anyone else. That landed. Bryce understood what it meant. The care Emily had taken with the information loop, the reason she'd gone upstairs alone, and her expression shifted into something that was sharper and grimmer than what had been there before. Where is he now? Administrative office, or he's moved since the incursion started. He would have needed to stay close enough to monitor, but not visible enough to draw attention during the lockdown. Emily paused. He sent me a transmission on the extraction team's frequency from inside the building. He still has a tactical radio, which means he came prepared for tonight. He knew it was happening. He helped plan it, Emily said. Bryce put 2 fingers up, and 2 Marines paled away from the corridor without being told anything more specific. She had that particular command efficiency that didn't require explaining itself.
I want you with me, Bryce said. I have patience. Derek can cover your patients. I need someone who can identify him on sight. Bryce was already moving. And I need someone who's been in this building long enough to know where he'd go. Emily thought about Douglas Falk, the edge of the social geography. The way he took his lunch alone, usually in the administrative office, facing the window that looked out over the receiving dock at the building's east side. The receiving dock where shipments came in. Loading dock, Emily said, east side. He'll want eyes on the dock and a clear path to the exterior if he decides to run. They moved fast, 4 of them now, Emily, Bryce, and 2 Marines, through the ground floor's service corridor. The storm was still working against the building's east face, louder on this side, the metal dock doors shuddering with each major gust. The receiving area was a large open room with rolling steel doors, a forklift, and a wall of metal shelving stacked with incoming supplies in various stages of processing. The lights were off, not a power failure. The switch was by the interior door. Somebody had turned them off deliberately. Bryce raised a fist and they stopped. One of the Marines produced a tactical light. Emily put her hand on the Marine's arm before he clicked it on. Wait, she said. She listened, breathing from the far right side of the room near the dock control panel. And underneath that, barely at the edge of audibility, the sound of fingers moving over a keypad. He was trying to open the dock door, the storm-rated exterior door that required a 6-digit code and a physical key override.
He had the code, of course he did, it was his system. But the key override was managed by facilities maintenance, and the physical key was on a hook in the maintenance office 40 feet from where he was standing. He didn't know that the facilities key had been moved 3 weeks ago when the maintenance chief had reorganized the hook board.
Emily knew because she'd been in the maintenance office returning a borrowed ladder at the time and had watched him do it. The key was now in the second drawer of the maintenance chief's desk under a stack of HVAC service records. Falk was stuck. Emily stepped forward in the dark and said, "Douglas, the breathing stopped." "The door won't open," she said. "The key isn't at the panel." A long silence. Then his voice. And it was not the calm, older voice from the radio. That had been someone else, someone further up. It was Falk's actual voice, which she'd heard in passing maybe 12 times in 8 months, always discussing supply orders or vendor invoices, and which now had the specific texture of a man understanding that the window he'd been watching for his exit had just closed. "Carter," he said. "Come away from the panel," she said. "The Marines behind me have lights and weapons, and they will use both." Another silence. She heard him step back from the panel. "I didn't know they were going to send that many people," he said. "I didn't know it was going to be. I thought it was a quiet extraction. One person, no incident." "There were patients in this building," Emily said. "I know." And something in those 2 words was not performing regret. It was the flat, collapsed sound of someone who has gotten to the other side of a decision and found it worse than they'd calculated. "I know that." Bryce clicked her light on.
Falk was standing 6 feet from the dock control panel, hands at his sides, a tactical radio on his belt that he hadn't reached for. He was wearing his standard administrative coordinator's badge on a lanyard, still like he'd forgotten to take it off when he decided to become something else tonight. He looked at Emily with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not defiant, not broken quite, something in between that had given up on performing either. "The manifests," he said. "You found them on one of the breach team." He absorbed this. "Then it's done," he said, and his voice went quieter. "It was done when you started moving through that building. I told them that. I told them Carter would." He stopped. "Told who?" Bryce said. Falk looked at the lieutenant colonel. Something moved across his face. "How high up does your clearance go?" "High enough," Bryce said. "No," Falk said, and his voice was careful now in a way that was different from the earlier resignation. "I mean specifically, because the people running this, the supply chain, the transit points, the funding, they're not external contractors. They're not civilian criminals who found a military route." He paused. "They're inside. You understand what I'm saying. The people who built this operation have ranks. They have installation access. They have oversight authority over the exact systems that would catch them." The dock room went quiet except for the storm. Emily looked at Bryce. Bryce's face had gone very still, in the way that faces go still when information lands that reorganizes everything around it. "Names," Bryce said. "I need assurances. Before, you are not in a position to negotiate assurances," Bryce said, and the authority in her voice was not performed. "You facilitated an armed entry into a medical facility housing active military patients. The only assurance I can offer you right now is that cooperation has historically been the factor that separates a federal sentence from a federal sentence that ends when you're 70. Falk looked at the floor. He looked at his badge on its lanyard. He said a name. Emily didn't recognize it, but Bryce did. She could tell by the way the lieutenant colonel's jaw tightened, a small and involuntary contraction, and by the way she reached immediately for her radio and then stopped, hand on the device, and did not key it.
Because keying that radio meant broadcasting to the installation's communication network, the same network managed by the installation's command infrastructure, the infrastructure that included, apparently, at least one person whose name Falk had just said in a loading dock in the middle of a blizzard. Bryce lowered her hand from the radio. She looked at Emily, and Emily understood in the specific and exhausting way she'd been understanding things tonight, one layer at a time, that they were standing in a secured room with a cooperating witness, an intelligence that implicated someone with the rank and access to make it disappear a second time, and the lieutenant colonel who'd arrived to rescue the situation was now holding a radio she couldn't safely use. "Your phone," Emily said, "not the installation network. Personal device, direct to someone outside this chain. If I call outside the chain without authorization, Lieutenant Colonel," Emily's voice was quiet, "they sent 9 men into this hospital to keep this information contained. They've already made it disappear once. If you use that radio, the name he just gave you reaches the people who need it to stay buried before it reaches anyone who can act on it.
Bryce held her gaze. 1 second. 2. She reached into her field jacket and pulled out her personal cell phone. The screen showed 1 bar of signal. Checked. Barely anything. The storm in the remote location working against them. She looked at the bar, then at Emily. And Emily saw the exact moment she decided. Bryce dialed. It rang 4 times before it connected, and the voice on the other end was rough with sleep and immediate alertness, the combination that meant someone accustomed to calls in the middle of the night who never fully stopped being on duty. Bryce said 7 words. "Sir, I need a secure line right now." She moved toward the far corner of the dock room for the call, and Emily stood in the dark with the 2 Marines and Douglas Falk in his lanyard badge, and the storm pressed against the dock doors, and the single bar of signal held. Then Bryce stopped walking. She stopped because her phone had buzzed.
Not the call she was on, something else coming in simultaneously. She looked at the screen. Her face changed. She turned back toward Emily, and the change in her expression was enough that one of the Marines shifted his stance without being told to. "There's a second team," Bryce said. "Not the extraction team, a cleanup unit. 3 vehicles came in from the west approach while we were focused on the north road." She looked at the Marines. "They're 2 minutes from the building." Emily looked at the dock doors, sealed, storm-rated, key override missing. She looked at the room, the shelving, the forklift. She looked at Bryce, who was still holding a phone with 1 bar of signal and a call to someone who couldn't act in 2 minutes. "They're not coming to extract," Emily said. "No," Bryce said, "they're not." The 2 words settled into the dock room like something physical. A cleanup unit was a different operational category from an extraction team. Extraction meant take and contain. Cleanup meant eliminate the problem at the source and remove the evidence, the manifests, the witness, the cooperating source, and anyone else in the building who'd seen enough to matter. The distinction was not subtle, and its implications were immediate. Emily looked at Bryce. "How many Marines do you have in the building right now?" 6 with me, plus the response team on the north road. They're inside by now or close. Where are the 9 from the breach team being held? East corridor, near the main entrance.
Emily moved before she finished processing the full picture, because the full picture didn't require processing, it required action. She went to the dock room's interior door and looked into the service corridor. Empty. She turned back. "We move Falk to the 2nd floor with the patients. He stays there with 2 Marines. The manifests and the radio, everything I took off the breach team goes with him, separate from his person, held by one of your people." She looked at Bryce. "Your phone call. Did it connect?" "Connected. I gave them the name. Whether they can act before..." "Did they confirm receipt?" "Yes." "Then the name is outside this building," Emily said. "That's what matters. Everything else is containment." She looked at the Marines. "Let's move." They moved Falk fast and without conversation, up through the stairwell to the 2nd floor. He didn't resist and didn't speak. He'd gone into the particular stillness of someone who has fully understood the consequences of their situation and is now conserving energy for whatever comes after. Emily handed the manifest to one of the Marines, a young woman named Specialist Okafor, who took them with the careful hands of someone who'd been told they were important without being told why, and gave her straightforward instructions. "Stay with the patients, lock the corridor door, do not open it for any reason until you hear Bryce's voice giving a specific phrase." The phrase was arbitrary. "North Road is clear." Simple enough to say, specific enough that it couldn't be guessed. Back downstairs in under 3 minutes. Bryce had used the time to reposition her remaining 4 Marines, 2 at the north entrance where the breach team had entered, 2 in the east corridor with the secured attackers. She'd also raised the response team on the installation radio, which was a calculated risk given what Falk had said about the network, but the alternative was defending the building with 4 people and no backup, and that math was worse. "Response team is inside," Bryce told her. 8 more plus the team leader. They're at the north end. That's 12 Marines total, 13 including me. Emily didn't count herself in that number because she didn't have a weapon, which put her in a categorically different position from the people who did. What she had was the building, and she was going to use it. "The west approached," she said. 3 vehicles. "How are they coming in? Road or overland?"
Road. The west maintenance track. It's the only passable route on that side. She knew the west maintenance track. It ran along the building service side and terminated at the utility entrance, a single steel door that accessed the boiler room and electrical systems. The maintenance track was also conveniently the narrowest vehicle approach to the building, barely wide enough for 1 vehicle at a time, flanked by the storm drainage channel on the left and the building's foundation planting on the right. 3 vehicles on that track could not operate simultaneously. They'd have to come in sequence. "Funnel point," she said. "If we can hold the utility entrance and the west-facing service corridor, they can't bring more than 1 vehicle's team to bear at a time." Bryce looked at her, not with the skepticism Emily was used to, the look that said, "You're a nurse, let the adults handle this," but with the focused attention of someone weighing tactical input on its merits. "We'd be splitting our force. We're already split across 3 floors."
Consolidating to the west face concentrates response where the threat is coming from. Emily paused. The east corridor breach team is secured and not going anywhere. The north entrance is covered. The second floor is locked down. The threat is the west approach, and right now there's nothing between those vehicles and the utility entrance. Bryce made the call in under 10 seconds, which was one of the things Emily was going to think about later, the specific competence of someone who could assess quickly and decide without performing the assessment. 4 Marines to the west service corridor, 2 staying east, 2 on the north entrance, Bryce and Emily moving to the boiler room that connected directly to the utility entrance. They reached the boiler room at 0334. The utility entrance was a heavy steel door with a push-bar interior release and a keyed exterior lock. Emily had used this entrance twice, once during an early morning shift when the main parking was full, and once to help the maintenance chief carry a replacement pump from the supply van. She knew the door's weight, the way it resisted the push-bar in cold weather when the frame contracted, the fact that the exterior light above it had been out for 6 weeks on a replacement request that facilities kept deferring. No light meant the approach was dark. She moved to the boiler room's single east-facing window, a narrow horizontal slot near the ceiling, designed for ventilation rather than visibility, and climbed on the service step to look through it. The window gave a restricted view of the west maintenance track, enough to see the approach. Headlights, 2 sets, moving slow. The third vehicle was behind them, invisible at this distance, or possibly staged further back. "They're here," she said. Bryce was beside her. She relayed the position to her Marines over radio and then went quiet, and they both watched the headlights come. The vehicle stopped 50 meters out. Engines cut. The headlights went dark. That was the first thing that was wrong. A cleanup unit coming in fast and confident didn't stop 50 meters out and cut their lights. That was a probe move, checking for response, seeing if the sudden darkness drew any reaction from the building. They knew the Marines were here. The North Road approach, the vehicles in the parking structure, the lights in the building, any of it could have been observed from a distance and relayed. They were adjusting. Emily stepped down from the service step.
"They know we're positioned," she said quietly. "They're not rushing." "They don't need to rush," Bryce said. "They just need the building eventually." "What they need," Emily said, "is the manifest in Falk. That's the mission." She thought about the forward transmission. "You don't have everything," the handler saying that before the cleanup unit had even arrived. Not to threaten, she realized now, but to stall, to keep her attention on what she'd found while the second piece of the operation moved into position. They were never going to come in through the west at full force. That's the visible play. They wanted us watching the west. She looked at the boiler room ceiling, at the utility conduit runs that crossed it east to west, and the access ladder bolted to the north wall that led up to the mechanical chase running above the building's service level. The same mechanical chase system she'd used earlier tonight. And the north entrance, the one with 2 Marines on it, the one nobody was watching closely because the visible threat was the west approach. She grabbed Bryce's arm. "North entrance, pull 1 team from the west corridor to the north now. They're splitting our attention." Bryce didn't argue. She keyed her radio. She was mid-transmission when the north entrance door came open. Not by force, not by breach, but by key. Someone with authorized access to the building's exterior key system. The kind of access that a procurement coordinator who managed facility vendor relationships might have arranged over 14 months of quiet preparation. A secondary key, cut and distributed before tonight. The 2 Marines on the north entrance responded immediately and professionally, which meant the situation at the north entrance was loud and physical and fast. And while it was loud, the west utility entrance opened.
The exterior lock turned from outside with a key that matched the same distribution, and the first of the cleanup unit came through into the boiler room. Emily was already behind the boiler. There were 3 of them through the utility entrance, moving in the careful way of people who expected resistance and were trying to locate it before engaging. The boiler room was loud. The machinery ran continuously and covered the sounds of movement in a way the rest of the building didn't. Emily had noted this the first time she'd come through here. The 3 men had noted it too, probably, which was why they were moving visually rather than by sound. She didn't have a weapon. She had a boiler room. The boiler room contained 3 natural gas-fired boiler units, each the size of a small car, connected by insulated pipe runs to the building's heating system, a bank of electrical panels on the south wall, the service step she'd used at the window, 2 wheeled equipment carts left by the maintenance crew, a fire suppression system with manual activation at the east panel, and a chemical storage cabinet for the boiler's water treatment system, padlocked, but with the combination written on a piece of tape on the inside of the adjacent cabinet, because someone had decided that was easier than remembering it. The kind of casual security failure that existed in every facility, everywhere. She knew all of this because she'd been in this room twice, and she looks at rooms. She opened the unlocked adjacent cabinet, read the combination off the tape, opened the chemical storage cabinet, and read the labels in the dark by feel. Boiler descaler, corrosive, aerosolized if heated, not useful right now. pH adjuster, same issue. Water softener salt,
Useless. And at the back, a sealed container of boiler system leak tracer dye, which came in a pressurized aerosol format for application in confined pipe spaces, and which in sufficient concentration was a highly effective mucous membrane irritant. She took it. The first man came around the east side of the center boiler unit. Emily was on the west side. She moved along the pipe run, keeping the boiler mass between them, and when the second man came around the west side, she had already moved north and was behind the equipment cart. The third man had positioned himself at the utility entrance, covering the exit. Smart. They'd done this before. She looked at the distance between her position and the electrical panel. 12 feet open floor, not crossable without being seen. She looked at the fire suppression activation panel. 6 feet, partially obscured by the pipe run on the south wall. She threw the aerosol container, not at any of the three men, at the far north corner of the boiler room, where it hit the concrete wall and clattered and rolled and produced the exact kind of misdirectional sound that drew eyes. All three drew eyes for the 2 seconds it took Emily to reach the fire suppression panel and pull the manual activation. The suppression system in the boiler room was CO2 rather than water. Water and electrical panels and gas systems didn't combine well, so the facility had installed a clean agent system. The activation flooded the room with CO2 discharge in approximately 4 seconds. Cold, dense, and in the boiler room's enclosed space, immediately vision obscuring. Emily had taken one full breath before she pulled the handle. She held it. She moved through this discharge toward the electrical panel by memory. 12 feet, 2 obstacles, southeast corner, and hit the main circuit breaker for the building's west service section. The lights in the boiler room, already dim, went out. The machinery went quiet. The CO2 discharge filled the sudden silence with a rushing white noise. She had approximately 25 seconds of held breath left. She moved back toward the utility entrance where the third man had been positioned, staying below the CO2 concentration layer, which settled denser at knee height. Someone was coughing. Someone else was moving without direction. She found the utility entrance door by feel and pulled it open. Outside the maintenance track, dark, cold, storm still pushing hard from the northwest.
She exhaled and breathed and moved east along the building's exterior wall. Around the building's corner, the north entrance situation had resolved. She could see it from here. Both Marines were on their feet. The unauthorized entry had been stopped and secured. Bryce was at the north entrance with her radio, giving instructions that Emily couldn't fully hear over the wind. 2 of the west corridor Marines were moving toward the north side. The remaining cleanup unit members, the vehicles had held at least 8 total, she estimated based on the 3 vehicles in standard team sizing, were somewhere between the maintenance track and the utility entrance, which currently had CO2 venting from it and no lights. The operation had lost its clean entry point. The element of surprise, which they'd had for about 90 seconds, was gone. Emily came around to the north entrance and found Bryce. Bryce looked at her, at the fact that she'd come from the exterior, from the direction of the west face, in the middle of a blizzard in scrubs, and had the grace not to ask the obvious question. 3 in the boiler room, Emily said. CO2 suppression activated, lights out on the west service circuit. They'll be out of the room in under a minute, but they'll be disoriented. We have 2 more from the north key entry, Bryce said, secured. The vehicle's on the maintenance track. They'll pull back when the entry teams don't report success. They need the building to be accessible. Then we make sure it's not. Bryce keyed her radio, pulled 2 Marines from the east corridor, and repositioned them to cover the utility entrance from the exterior, outside in the storm, using the building's northwest corner for cover. It was not a comfortable position. Neither Marine said anything about that.
The next 11 minutes were ugly in the way that real situations were ugly. Not dramatic, not clean, but grinding and incremental, and full of small decisions that mattered more than they looked like they should. 2 of the cleanup team from the boiler room came out the utility entrance into the waiting Marines. One tried the building's west maintenance window and found it locked from inside. One simply sat down on the maintenance track in the blizzard, which turned out to be a man who'd taken enough CO2 exposure that his coordination was significantly impaired, and who was going to need medical evaluation before anyone interrogated him. Emily assessed him herself, because he was technically on her building's doorstep, and she was still, through all of this, a nurse. Oxygen saturation low, but not critical. Pulse elevated. He was conscious and coherent enough to be scared, which was a positive neurological sign. Breathe slowly, she told him, kneeling in the snow. You're going to be okay. He looked at her. He was probably 30 years old. He had the kind of face that hadn't signed up for this exact scenario when it made whatever choices had led here. Who are you? He said. His voice was rough from the CO2. I'm the nurse, Emily said. By 0412, the exterior was secured. The 3 vehicles on the maintenance track had not moved. The drivers, it turned out, had been instructed to hold position and wait for the entry team signal.
And when no signal came, they'd sat in their vehicles in the blizzard for 38 minutes before Bryce's Marines walked up on both sides simultaneously. And that was that. 14 additional members of the cleanup unit in custody, bringing the total to 23 people in the building or on its immediate grounds who had no legitimate reason to be there. The storm had peaked and was dropping. The first gray light of an Arctic dawn was a theoretical possibility somewhere behind the cloud cover, still hours away, but approaching. Emily sat on a supply crate in the east corridor outside the nursing station and let herself feel how tired she was for approximately 4 minutes.
Dara came down from the second floor and found her there. "Roa's asking what the noise was," Dara said. "Tell him there was a security drill. He's a Marine. He's not going to believe that." "Tell him anyway." Emily pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. Her shoulder was producing a specific and insistent complaint that she'd been ignoring for 2 hours. The cut on her knuckle had dried closed, but was going to need proper cleaning. She was also, she realized, extremely cold, having spent portions of the last 40 minutes outside in sub-zero temperatures and scrubs. "How's Vasquez?" Fully awake now and very confused. She keeps asking about the helicopter. "What helicopter?" Dara looked at her. "Exactly. There wasn't one, but she says she heard rotors." Emily lifted her head. Rotors. The building had been loud and chaotic, and the storm had been providing constant noise cover, but rotors had a specific frequency that penetrated building structure differently than wind. She stood up. "When?" she said. She said maybe 20 minutes ago. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming. Emily was already moving toward the window at the end of the east corridor, which faced north and had a partial view of the installation approach and the open ground between the hospital and the tree line. There was a helicopter on the ground, found a quarter-mile out, dark painted, rotor still, no lights. It had come in during the cleanup unit engagement, when everyone's attention was west and north, and it was not a Marine installation helicopter. The tail configuration was wrong. She found Bryce in the main corridor on a radio coordinating the custody processing of the 23 detainees. She put her hand on Bryce's arm without apology. "There's a helicopter on the north ground, quarter-mile, dark, no lights. Came in during the engagement." Bryce's radio went down. She looked at Emily. "That's not one of ours." She said it wasn't a question. "No, it's him." Bryce said the name Falk gave us. If he knew the cleanup unit was compromised, he came himself. Emily said. The weight of it settled between them. Whoever this was, the name she still didn't recognize, but Bryce had. The name that had made the lieutenant colonel's jaw tighten, had watched his extraction team fail, and his cleanup unit fail, and had decided that the only remaining option was personal intervention, which meant he had enough at stake to be here in person, in a dark helicopter at 4 a.m. in a blizzard in Alaska.
That was not the behavior of someone on the operational periphery. That was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what the manifest contained and what their existence meant for him specifically. Bryce raised her radio and gave a 4-word instruction to her team leader. "North perimeter, immediate." Then she looked at Emily. "He'll have come with protection. How many could fit in that helicopter? Configuration like that, pilot plus 4 comfortably. 6 if they're willing to be uncomfortable. He'll be willing," Emily said. "Everyone he sent tonight has failed. He'll want people around him." "He's also trapped," Bryce said. "The North Road is covered. The storm's coming back up. That helicopter is not lifting off in the next 2 hours. He came here because he thought the cleanup unit would handle it, and he could walk into a cleared building." She paused. "He didn't know you were here." Emily thought about that. 3 years of quiet posting. 3 years of being the nurse who filed a report that went nowhere and got transferred to the edge of the continent as a consequence. 3 years of being in operational terms, managed, contained, strategically irrelevant. They had not known she was here. Not in the way that mattered. They'd known her name was on a scheduling report and that she'd accessed records that could eventually lead somewhere inconvenient, and they'd sent a team to retrieve her as a precaution. But they had not known, whoever was sitting in that dark helicopter a quarter-mile away, had not known what she actually was, what she could do, what she'd already done. Tonight, 3 years of being underestimated by people who thought they knew exactly what a nurse looked like. "He's going to try to negotiate," Emily said. "When the perimeter closes, he's going to want to talk. He has rank and he has lawyers, and he's going to believe that the name and the rank are enough to create enough institutional confusion to give him time to build a defense." "He might be right about the institutional confusion," Bryce said carefully. "He's not right about the time," Emily said, "because the phone call you made went outside this network, and the name is already in the hands of whoever you called, and that person is—" She stopped.
Who did you call? Bryce held her gaze for a moment.
My counterpart at the Defense Intelligence Field Office in Anchorage, she said. Someone I've known for 11 years, who is not part of any installation command structure and who has been running a parallel inquiry into the supply chain anomalies for the past 6 months. Emily absorbed this. They've been building toward this, she said. They had everything except the transit hub and the internal source. Bryce said, Falk and the manifests are the 2 pieces they couldn't find. She paused. You handed them both in. One night outside, the north perimeter was moving. Emily could hear the radio traffic, clipped, coordinated, Marines establishing positions in a closing arc around the helicopter's landing point. The dark aircraft sat on the open ground north of the hospital, rotors still, and whatever was happening inside it was invisible from here. The radio on Bryce's hip crackled, her team leader's voice. Contact made. Individual inside the aircraft is requesting to speak with the commanding officer on scene. He's using a rank designation, says he outranks everyone present. Bryce looked at Emily. Something in her expression was not quite satisfaction and not quite anger, the specific feeling of someone watching a years-long structure begin to come apart at the points it was always going to fail. She keyed her radio. Tell him the commanding officer will be there shortly. She lowered the radio. I want you with me. I'm a nurse, Emily said. I'm not. You're the reason I have anything to bring to that aircraft, Bryce said. You're coming. They walked the quarter-mile in the dark, in the wind, across the open ground north of the hospital. 2 Marines ahead, 2 behind. The helicopter grew from a dark shape to a specific aircraft. As they approached and the door was open, and a man was standing in the doorway with the kind of posture that had spent decades being the most important person in every room. Emily didn't know his face. She'd seen his name on Bryce's expression, and that was all she'd had. He looked at Bryce first, and the look was calculating, assessing rank, leverage, institutional relationship, whether any of this could still be managed. Then he looked at Emily. The calculation changed. She could see it change.
He was looking at Scrubs, at a split knuckle, at a woman who had walked across a dark field in the blizzard, after the night she'd apparently just had. And the thing behind his eyes was shifting from calculation into something that was making a rapid and unpleasant reassessment of the night's events. You're Carter, he said. Yes, she said. You're the nurse. She held his gaze and said nothing. And in the silence, the wind came through hard from the northwest, and the Marines held their positions, and the Arctic pre-dawn hung over all of it, dark and absolute. I want counsel present before any. Brigadier General Harlan Voss, Bryce said, and the name in the open air, said aloud with witnesses and recording equipment on every Marine present, had a finality to it that silenced him mid-sentence. You are being detained in connection with an investigation into weapons trafficking facilitated through military medical supply infrastructure. You have the right to remain silent. She kept going, the full recitation, formal and procedural, and Voss stood in the helicopter doorway and listened to it with the expression of a man watching something he built over years come apart in the space of a single pre-dawn field. Emily watched his face through the